I want to talk about a subject today that we don't talk about very often, and that is death. And so today I have a story from a client that I worked with. What happens when the love of your life dies? And I know it's a hard one, but so many people experience it that I just can't ignore it. So I hope that you will glean something from this and that will support you if you're experiencing this. If you have a friend who's lost a spouse or a partner, please listen to this because it may help you understand where they are. It's for each of you who have lost the love of your life to death. They say that death is the final goodbye, and I know that Marie would want me to share her story with you. The quiet of Marie's heart. Marie sat by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the cold, fogged up glass. The world outside was quiet, and nothing moved in the thick stillness of the morning. The house felt way too empty. It had been weeks since Oliver had passed, and yet every day felt like the first one. The first day without his laugh, without his touch, without his warmth. She tried to remember the sound of his voice, but it seemed to fade more each day in those rare moments when she could still hear it in her mind. It was like a distant echo, faint and hollow. She missed him so much it felt like her chest would cave in, like her heart was a small, fragile thing, unable to bear the weight of such loss. It was anger that first came after the numbness, anger that he was gone, that cancer had stolen him from her, anger at the unfairness of it all. She paced her room in the middle of the night. Her thoughts were too chaotic to string together. How could he leave? And why did he leave her? She stood there with her hands clenched at her sides, staring at the place where his favorite chair was. Her mind was full of accusations at him for leaving her, at the universe for being so cruel, at herself for not being able to save him. In those moments, she felt as if she were drowning in that anger, as though it were all consuming. She didn't even know how to stop it. And then the sadness would come. It crept into every corner of her life, curling around her in soft, aching waves. It was the quiet kind of grief that made it really hard to breathe, hard to get out of bed. There were days when Marie couldn't even bring herself to leave the house. She'd lie on the couch, staring at the empty space next to her, remembering how his body had once filled it. She would cry silently, the tears falling without warning, like the rain outside, constant and unstoppable. Sometimes she would wander through her house, her fingers brushing the things he had touched. His books were stacked on the coffee table, a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, his coat hanging by the door. She would pick up his jacket and wrap it around herself, hoping that somehow by doing so she could feel his presence again. But it just wasn't the same. Grief had become her shadow. It was about this time that her family and friends began to reach out. They called her, left messages, tried to fill her days with visits and offers of support. They couldn't understand why she wasn't responding and why she wasn't getting out of bed, why she wasn't moving on. They didn't know how to fix her. And like so many people who had never faced such a deep loss, they expected her to feel better eventually. Her mother, always the optimist, called every morning. Her voice was cheery. Marie, darling, you need to eat something. It's time to get out of the house. Fresh air will do wonders, I promise. We'll go for a walk, okay? But Marie didn't feel like walking. She didn't feel like doing anything. Her mother's words only highlighted how far apart they had become. Her mother didn't understand. She had not lost the love of her life, so how could she know how this felt? Then there was Sophie, her best friend since childhood. Sophie would show up with casseroles and tea, trying to coax her out of the house with the promise of distractions. We could watch that new series you always wanted to see just for a little while. Sophie said one evening, her voice laced with an urgency that Marie could hear but could not feel. But even as Sophie spoke, Marie could feel her own inability to care about the things she once did. She couldn't pretend to laugh at a sitcom or engage in a conversation about TV shows. The weight of Oliver's absence was far too heavy for small talk. Her friends told her that it would be easier with time. They told her to focus on all of the good memories, to hold on to those and to let go of the pain. They were well-meaning, of course. They didn't know that the good memories were the hardest to bear. Each one felt like a cruel reminder that what she no longer had. She tried to hold on to them, but they slipped through her fingers. Each memory turned into something bittersweet, too sharp to hold. The advice was well-meaning, but it didn't feel right. They spoke about her grief as though it was something that needed to be fixed, as though if she just followed their instructions, ate something, went outside, remembered the happy times, she would be just fine. But Marie felt no need to fix it. She didn't want to feel better. She wanted Oliver back. She wanted the world before illness, before the pain, before the empty space beside her. Then there were their children, 3 precious lives that had been shaped by Oliver's love. Ethan, their eldest, was 11, and Marie could already see the weight of grief settling into his eyes. He was the one who asked the hardest questions. Mom, why did Dad have to die? Why can't we just make him better? His voice quivered with disbelief, and Marie found herself at a loss for words, caught between wanting to protect him and knowing that nothing she could say would take away his pain. Lily was their 9-year-old daughter, who spent days drawing pictures of their family. Her crayons pressed so hard against the paper that it left deep imprints. Sometimes she would sit in her room surrounded by these drawings, and Marie would find her silently staring at the sketches. No one could understand the magnitude of Lily's sadness. She missed the way her father used to spin her around the living room. His laughter was contagious. Now she held on to his picture at night, clutching as if it would bring him back. And then there was little Noah, just 6 years old, who didn't quite understand why his dad wasn't there anymore. He still asked, "When is Dad coming home?" His innocent voice filled with confusion. "Mom, I want to show Dad my new toy," he'd say, and he'd hold something up that had caught his attention. "Where's Daddy, and why isn't he playing with me?" And Marie would swallow the lump in her throat, her own grief pulling at her chest, and she would tell him as gently as she could, "Daddy's not coming back, sweetheart, but he will always be in your heart." The children's grief was a mirror to her own, but it was different. It was raw and innocent, untainted by the complexities of adult sorrow. She wanted to shield them from a world of pain, but she couldn't. They had lost someone that was the most important person of their life. Marie watched them and she felt her heart breaking for them. She also saw the way they were struggling to find their way through the fog. Each of them were retreating in their own way. Ethan buried himself in schoolwork and books. Lily clung to old memories, and Noah, too young to fully understand, turned to her with wide, searching eyes, hoping she would be the answer to the aching in his chest. Grief had become their shared space, an invisible weight on the walls in their words, in their silences, and there was no way to fix it, not for her and not for them. They were all walking through it side by side, each of them carrying the loss in their own way, but none of them had the answers. But slowly, with a little time, Marie found herself drifting into acceptance. It didn't feel like moving on, not exactly. Moving on seemed impossible. Oliver would always be a part of them, woven into the fabric of their lives. They would all have to find a way to breathe again, to keep going, even if it felt like the weight of loss would crush them. The grief didn't disappear. It was still there, the quiet ache between everything. But she found a way to live with it. Some days were easier, and some days she didn't cry at all. But on the days when the tears would come again, she let them. She let the pain wash over her like a tide, then receded back into herself. There was always the bloom in her heart that was a fragile hope, like the first signs of spring breaking through winter soil. It wasn't a big thing at first. It was a small, tender thing. The knowledge that even though Oliver is gone, he had loved them all, and that love would remain with them always. Marie stood up and walked to the bedroom where a photograph of Oliver rested on the nightstand. She picked it up, her fingers grazing over his smiling face. And she says, "I will carry you with me always." And for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of peace. If you've lost the love of your life to death, or someone close to you has, please go to mammothedge.com and take the life assessment. I would love to support you as you allow the feelings of loss to pour through. Thank you.